I'm Rebecca Thompson, 34 years old, and I never expected that a family Sunday dinner would shatter everything I believed about my identity. My brother Derek stood over my 8-year-old daughter Emma, his face twisted with rage as he hurled a gnawed chicken bone onto her plate. "Your mother's nothing but a bastard," he snarled, his voice dripping with 20 years of hidden resentment. Emma's innocent blue eyes filled with tears as the greasy bone landed with a wet thud among her mashed potatoes. The dining room fell silent except for the ticking of our grandmother's antique clock. Before we dive into this shocking family betrayal, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story grabs your attention, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life family drama. Trust me, you won't believe how much darker this gets, and the revenge I eventually served was colder than the dinner that started it all. Our monthly family gatherings at the old Thompson house in suburban Dayton, Ohio had always been tense, but this particular Sunday in October felt different from the moment I walked through the front door. The familiar scent of my mother Linda's pot roast filled the air, mixing with the underlying tension that seemed to permeate every corner of our childhood home. My father Robert sat in his usual spot, at the head of the mahogany dining table that had belonged to his parents, while my aunts Carol and Susan bustled around the kitchen, with their usual chatter about neighborhood gossip and their grandchildren's accomplishments. Derek had arrived before me with his wife Sarah and their twin boys, Marcus and Dylan, who were busy roughhousing in the living room while Emma tried to join their games despite being younger and smaller. I noticed immediately that Derek had been drinking, his face flushed and his movements slightly unsteady as he carved the roast with unnecessary aggression. Sarah kept shooting worried glances at her husband, clearly sensing the storm brewing beneath his carefully maintained facade of family respectability. The conversation, during dinner, had been relatively normal until Dad mentioned updating his will and the family photos that lined the hallway leading to the kitchen. Derek's jaw tightened as Dad spoke about legacy and making sure future generations would remember the Thompson family history. That's when I made the mistake of suggesting we take new family photos to include Emma and the boys, mentioning how much she'd grown since the last professional portraits were taken when she was 5. Derek's explosion came without warning, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor as he shot to his feet. "Family photos," he laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and ugly in the suddenly silent room. "That's rich, coming from someone who doesn't even belong in this family." The words hung in the air like poison gas, and I felt my stomach drop as every conversation around the table ceased. Aunt Carol's fork clattered to her plate, and Uncle Jim stopped mid-chew, his eyes darting between Derek and me with growing alarm. Emma looked up at her uncle with confusion written across her small features, not understanding the venom in his voice or why the adults had all suddenly gone quiet. I reached over to squeeze her hand reassuringly, my heart hammering as Derek's alcohol-fueled rage continued to build. "Derek, what are you talking about?" I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "Maybe you should sit down and finish your dinner." That's when he grabbed the chicken bone from his plate, a piece he'd been gnawing on throughout the meal, and hurled it directly at Emma. The bone hit her plate with a sickening wet sound, spattering gravy across her yellow dress, and causing her to flinch backward in shock. "Your mother's nothing but a bastard," he snarled again, pointing an accusing finger at me while Emma started to cry. "She doesn't have Thompson blood running through her veins, and neither do you, kid." The room erupted into chaos as several family members began talking at once, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of shock and confusion. Sarah grabbed Derek's arm, trying to pull him back into his seat, while hissing urgent warnings about the children being present. Dad's face had gone pale as parchment, and Mom looked like she might faint, her hand pressed against her throat as if she couldn't breathe. Aunt Susan immediately moved to comfort Emma, pulling my sobbing daughter into her arms while shooting murderous looks at her nephew. Derek wasn't finished with his assault. Reaching into his jacket pocket, He produced a folded piece of paper with the kind of theatrical flourish that only came from someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks. "I had DNA testing done," he announced triumphantly, waving the document in the air like a weapon. "Got some of her hair from Mom's bathroom drawer during my last visit. Guess what? Rebecca Thompson isn't a Thompson at all. She's the product of Mom's affair with Jim Morrison from down the street." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the boys had stopped their playing in the next room, sensing the adult drama unfolding. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, all the air leaving my lungs as Derek's words sank in. Jim Morrison had been our neighbor for as long as I could remember, a quiet widower who kept to himself, but had always been particularly kind to me when I was growing up. He'd helped me fix my bicycle chain, taught me to change a tire, and attended my high school graduation when Dad had to work late. Mom's face crumbled, and Dad's hands began to shake as he set down his water glass with deliberate care. The truth was written across their features, confirming what Derek had just revealed with cruel precision. 25 years of lies, 25 years of living as someone I wasn't, and my own brother had been the one to destroy the illusion with the vindictive pleasure of someone settling a decades-old score. After the extended family members hurriedly gathered their belongings and fled the house like survivors of a natural disaster, we were left with the wreckage of what had once been a functional family dynamic. Emma clung to my side, her small body still trembling from the shock of Derek's public attack, while I struggled to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The dining room felt like a crime scene, with the abandoned dinner plates and scattered napkins serving as evidence of the explosion that had torn through our carefully constructed family mythology. Mom finally broke the suffocating silence, her voice barely above a whisper as she confirmed what we all already knew to be true. The affair with Jim Morrison had lasted nearly 2 years when I was conceived, beginning when Dad was frequently traveling for his construction business, and she felt abandoned and lonely. She'd never been completely certain about my paternity, but had convinced herself that I belonged to Robert, choosing to believe the lie rather than face the devastating consequences of the truth. Dad's revelation was perhaps even more crushing than Mom's confession. He'd suspected for years that I might not be his biological daughter, noting the differences in my appearance and personality compared to Derek, but he'd chosen to love me as his own despite his doubts. However, Derek had been working on him for months, poisoning his mind with carefully planted suggestions about family loyalty, bloodlines, and the importance of keeping the Thompson legacy intact for future generations. The financial manipulation cut deeper than the emotional betrayal. 6 months earlier, Derek had convinced Dad to remove me from the will entirely, arguing that family assets should remain within the bloodline, and that I'd already received enough support over the years through college tuition and help with Emma's expenses after my divorce. The family construction business, which I'd assumed would someday provide security for Emma's future, had been restructured with Derek as the sole beneficiary. Even the house we were sitting in, which had been in the Thompson family for 3 generations, now belonged exclusively to Derek through a quiet title transfer that had been completed just weeks before tonight's dinner. Emma's confusion was heartbreaking to witness. At 8 years old, she didn't understand the complex dynamics of paternity or the legal implications of inheritance, but she could sense that something fundamental had shifted in our family structure. She kept asking why Uncle Derek had been so mean to her, why Grandpa looked so sad, and whether we were still welcome at family dinners. I struggled to find age-appropriate answers that wouldn't further traumatize her while internally grappling with my own identity crisis. Derek's satisfaction was palpable as he watched the destruction he'd orchestrated unfold around him. There was something deeply disturbing about the pleasure he took in my pain, a vindictive joy that suggested this moment had been years in the planning. He'd always been the golden child, the son who carried the family name and followed Dad into the construction business, but apparently my very existence had been a source of resentment that had festered and grown until it demanded expression through the most hurtful means possible. The legal documents Derek produced during our confrontation revealed the scope of his long-term strategy. Property deeds, business partnership agreements, and bank account authorizations had all been systematically altered over the past year, effectively removing me from any claim to family assets. He'd used his position as Dad's business partner and Mom's emotional guilt about the affair to manipulate them into believing that cutting me out was the morally correct choice, the only way to preserve family integrity and honor. Sarah's complicity in the scheme became apparent as she tried to justify her husband's actions by claiming that blood relations were more important than the bonds of affection and shared history. She spoke about protecting her own children's inheritance and ensuring that the Thompson name wouldn't be diluted by illegitimate claims, using language that made me feel like an interloper who'd been masquerading as family for decades. The first near defeat came that night as I sat in my small apartment with Emma sleeping fitfully in the next room, questioning everything I thought I knew about my identity and place in the world. The family photos on my mantel suddenly seemed like evidence of a decades-long lie, and the childhood memories I treasured felt tainted by the knowledge that my father had been living with doubts about my paternity, while still choosing to love me. The financial implications were staggering, but the emotional devastation was far worse, leaving me feeling rootless and fundamentally disconnected from the only family I'd ever known. Derek's victory seemed complete as I realized that he'd not only destroyed my sense of belonging, but had also secured his position as the undisputed heir to everything our parents had built. The Thompson legacy would continue through him while I became a footnote in family history, a cautionary tale about the consequences of maternal infidelity and the importance of keeping bloodlines pure. The walk to Jim Morrison's house 3 days after the dinner from hell felt like crossing an emotional minefield. Every step down Maple Street reminded me of childhood moments that now carried completely different meanings, from the times he'd helped me learn to ride a bike to the summer evenings when he'd shared stories about his late wife while we watered his rose garden together. His modest ranch house sat exactly 4 doors down from my childhood home, close enough that my mother's affair had been conducted practically under our entire neighborhood's nose. Jim answered the door with the careful expression of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for 25 years. At 62, he still carried himself with the quiet dignity I remembered from my youth, though his hair had gone completely silver, and his weathered hands showed the effects of decades spent working as an electrician. His living room was exactly as I remembered, filled with photographs of his late wife Margaret, and the life they'd built together before her death from cancer when I was 12 years old. His version of the affair painted a picture of 2 lonely people finding comfort in each other during a difficult period in both their lives. Dad's frequent business trips had left Mom isolated with a toddler Derek and growing resentment about her confined domestic role, while Jim was struggling with Margaret's first cancer diagnosis and the crushing reality that their dreams of having children would never be realized. The relationship had lasted from the time I was conceived until Margaret's remission brought them hope for a normal future together. Jim's regret was genuine and profound, but what struck me most was his admission that he'd always suspected I might be his daughter. The timing of my birth, combined with my resemblance to Margaret and personality traits that differed markedly from both Robert and Derek, had made him wonder for decades whether he'd unknowingly gained a child during the most complicated period of his life. He'd kept his distance emotionally to avoid disrupting our family, but he'd always felt a special connection that now made perfect sense. Derek's campaign of community destruction had begun within hours of our family dinner explosion. Social media posts carefully crafted to seem like concerned family updates gradually revealed the shocking truth about my illegitimate status, painting me as someone who'd knowingly deceived the community about my heritage while benefiting from Thompson family resources and reputation. His wife Sarah had enlisted her network of neighborhood friends to spread additional rumors about my character and moral failings, suggesting that apple doesn't fall far from the tree when it comes to infidelity and deception. The professional impact was swift and devastating. 3 major real estate clients cancelled their listings within a week, citing concerns about working with someone whose family situation was so publicly messy and complicated. The local real estate board received anonymous complaints about my business practices, forcing me to spend money I couldn't afford on legal representation to defend my professional license against completely fabricated charges of ethical violations. Emma's school experience became increasingly difficult, as other children began repeating things their parents had said about our family situation. 8-year-olds don't understand the nuances of adult relationships and genetic heritage, but they are expertly equipped to sense vulnerability and exploit it with the casual cruelty that only children possess. My daughter came home in tears multiple times that first week, asking why her friends were calling her names she didn't understand and whether she was still allowed to love Grandpa Robert even though they didn't share blood. The community response revealed the ugly underbelly of small-town social dynamics. People I'd known since childhood suddenly became distant and uncomfortable around me, as if illegitimate birth might be contagious, or my mother's decades-old affair somehow reflected on my own moral character. The grocery store checkout lines became exercises in enduring whispered conversations and pointing, while former friends began crossing the street to avoid having to acknowledge my presence. Derek's manipulation extended beyond our immediate family to include aunts, uncles, and cousins who'd previously welcomed me as a beloved family member. His carefully orchestrated campaign painted my mother as a manipulative adulteress, and me as the unwitting beneficiary of a fraud that had cost the real Thompson children their rightful inheritance. Family members who'd known me since birth suddenly began questioning whether my college tuition, wedding costs, and help during my divorce had been legitimate family support, or misappropriation of resources that should have gone to Derek and his children. Sarah's participation in the character assassination proved particularly painful, because we'd previously maintained a cordial sister-in-law relationship. She began hosting coffee meetings and play dates specifically designed to exclude Emma and me while spreading increasingly elaborate stories about my supposed deceptions and ungrateful behavior toward the family that had raised me despite knowing the truth about my parentage. The financial pressure mounted as my real estate business continued to hemorrhage clients and reputation in the tight-knit community where word-of-mouth referrals made the difference between success and failure. Bills began piling up while income dried up, and Emma's college fund, which I'd been carefully building since her birth, started looking like it might need to be liquidated just to cover basic living expenses during the crisis Derek had manufactured. Derek's satisfaction with the destruction he'd orchestrated was evident in the smug expression he wore during the few times our paths crossed, at local businesses or community events. He'd achieved everything he'd apparently wanted. Complete ownership of the family legacy, social validation of his position as the legitimate Thompson heir, and my thorough humiliation in front of everyone who'd known us growing up. The second major attack came when Derek convinced several longtime family friends to publicly distance themselves from me, issuing carefully worded statements about the importance of supporting the real Thompson family during this difficult time of revelations and betrayals. These people had been at my wedding, had celebrated Emma's birth, and had been part of my support system through my divorce, but Derek's manipulation proved more powerful than decades of genuine relationship. The systematic destruction of my real estate business accelerated during the third week after Derek's revelation, when friends of his began cancelling property listings en masse, while spreading carefully crafted lies about my professional competence and ethical standards. The Thompson Construction Company had extensive connections throughout the local real estate market, giving Derek access to a network of contractors, property developers, and homeowners who could effectively blacklist me from the industry that provided my livelihood and professional identity. Maria Rodriguez had been my assistant for 3 years, handling administrative tasks, and client communications with the kind of efficiency and dedication that made her invaluable to my small operation. When other employees began looking for new positions to distance themselves from the scandal surrounding my family situation, Maria surprised me by not only staying, but actively defending my reputation to anyone who would listen. Her loyalty became a lifeline during the darkest period of professional and personal assault. Derek's third major attack came in the form of a formal complaint filed with the Ohio Real Estate Commission, alleging that I'd engaged in fraudulent practices, including misrepresentation of properties, kickback schemes with inspectors, and failure to disclose conflicts of interest to clients. The charges were completely fabricated, but the investigation process required extensive documentation, legal representation, and time away from actual business activities that I could ill afford during an already devastating period. Maria's investigation into Derek's business practices began as simple curiosity about someone who seemed determined to destroy a person she respected and had grown to care about. Her background in bookkeeping and natural attention to detail led her to notice discrepancies in public records related to Thompson Construction's tax filings and licensing requirements. What started as casual research evolved into a comprehensive examination of financial documents that revealed a pattern of illegal activities spanning several years. The discovery of Derek's embezzlement from the family business provided the first evidence that his campaign against me might be motivated by more than just family loyalty and bloodline purity. Thompson Construction had been systematically drained of resources through inflated subcontractor payments to companies that existed only on paper, equipment purchases that were immediately resold for cash, and material orders that were diverted to Derek's personal property improvement projects, while still being charged to company accounts. Emma's resilience during this period amazed and inspired me in ways I hadn't expected. Despite the chaos surrounding our family and the cruelty she was experiencing at school, my 8-year-old daughter began showing a maturity and strength of character that reminded me why fighting for our future was essential. She started standing up to the children who were bullying her about our family situation, explaining with simple clarity that love was more important than blood, and that being different didn't make someone bad or wrong. Jim Morrison's support came gradually, as he began to understand the scope of Derek's assault on my reputation and livelihood. His initial hesitation about becoming involved evolved into genuine concern for my welfare, and a desire to build some kind of relationship with the daughter he'd never known he had. His offer of financial assistance was carefully made to avoid any appearance of impropriety, but his emotional support became increasingly important as my traditional family support system continued to crumble. The evidence Maria uncovered about Derek's business practices provided crucial ammunition for defending myself against his attacks. Bank records showing suspicious transactions, tax documents revealing unreported income, and contract irregularities that suggested bid rigging and fraud began to paint a picture of someone whose own criminal activity made his moral outrage about my legitimacy seem hypocritical at best. Derek's gambling debts emerged as another component of his financial desperation and motivation for securing exclusive access to family assets. Credit card statements and loan documents revealed a pattern of increasingly risky behavior that had put his own family's financial security in jeopardy, while he publicly criticized my character and worthiness of Thompson family support. His wife Sarah's growing awareness of their precarious financial situation began to create cracks in their united front against me. The professional hearing that nearly cost me my real estate license became a turning point when Maria's testimony and documented evidence revealed the coordinated nature of Derek's campaign against me. Her presentation to the review board demonstrated that the complaints against my business practices were part of a systematic attempt to destroy my livelihood rather than legitimate concerns about professional misconduct. The hearing officer's recognition that I was the victim of a harassment campaign rather than the perpetrator of ethical violations marked the beginning of my professional redemption. The second near defeat came during the lowest point of the investigation, when it appeared that Derek's false accusations might result in the loss of my professional license regardless of their lack of merit. The stress of defending my reputation, while watching my business collapse, and my daughter suffer the consequences of adult conflicts, brought me close to complete breakdown. Only Maria's unwavering support, and Emma's continued faith in our ability to overcome the crisis gave me the strength to continue fighting rather than surrendering to Derek's apparent victory. Building a counter-strategy required swallowing my pride and accepting help from people like Jim and Maria, who believed in my innocence and worth despite the community pressure to abandon me. Learning about Derek's vulnerabilities, including his gambling addiction, troubled marriage, and criminal business practices, provided the foundation for fighting back rather than simply enduring his attacks while hoping the storm would eventually pass. Derek's nuclear option arrived on a Tuesday morning in November via certified mail, delivered by a process server who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the nature of his assignment. The legal documents alleging that I was an unfit mother and demanding a custody evaluation for Emma represented the most vicious escalation in his campaign to destroy every aspect of my life that brought meaning or joy. The timing was particularly cruel, coming just days before Emma's 9th birthday, and during a period when she was finally beginning to recover from the trauma of that horrible family dinner. The custody petition painted a picture of me as an unstable woman whose discovery of her illegitimate status had triggered a mental breakdown that endangered my daughter's well-being and development. Derek claimed that Emma was being negatively affected by the family drama, that her grades were suffering, and that she was exhibiting behavioral problems that required intervention from responsible family members who could provide stability during the crisis. Sarah's sworn affidavit supported these allegations, with carefully selected incidents taken completely out of context to suggest neglect and emotional abuse. The legal battle that ensued required resources. I didn't have an emotional energy that was already stretched beyond its limits. The court-appointed custody evaluator conducted interviews with Emma, school officials, neighbors, and family members, creating a process that forced my daughter to repeatedly discuss traumatic events while having her every word and action scrutinized for evidence of damage or dysfunction. The evaluation period stretched for months, during which Emma's anxiety about potentially being separated from me became visible in sleepless nights and reluctance to attend school. Derek's attorney, a high-powered family law specialist, whose fees alone suggested serious financial backing, used my illegitimate status as evidence that I lacked the moral foundation necessary for proper parenting. The legal strategy suggested that children needed stable family structures, with clear lineages, and that Emma would be better served by placement with relatives, who could provide traditional family values rather than exposure to the ongoing scandal surrounding my parentage and my mother's past infidelity. Emma's voice in the custody proceedings became the most powerful weapon against Derek's manipulation. When given the opportunity to speak with the judge in chambers, my 9-year-old daughter displayed a wisdom and clarity that impressed even the court officials who dealt with family custody disputes on a daily basis. She explained that she loved me, that she felt safe and cared for in our home, and that being different from other families didn't make us wrong or bad. Her simple statement that she wanted to stay with her mommy because I made her feel loved and protected carried more weight than hours of legal arguments. Derek's marriage began imploding during this period as Sarah discovered the full extent of his gambling debts and the multiple affairs he'd been conducting while publicly championing family values and moral purity. The private investigator she hired to document his infidelity uncovered not only evidence of cheating, but also suspicious financial transactions that suggested he was using Thompson Construction resources to fund his extracurricular activities. Sarah's realization that her husband was not the man she'd married transformed her from an ally in his campaign against me into a potential witness for my defense. The investigation into Derek's domestic behavior revealed a pattern of emotional and verbal abuse that had escalated as his financial problems worsened and his schemes became more desperate. Sarah's friends began sharing stories about bruises they'd noticed and explanations that hadn't quite made sense, painting a picture of a man whose public persona masked increasingly erratic and violent private behavior. The contrast between Derek's claims about family values and his actual treatment of his own wife and children became impossible to ignore. Sarah's decision to switch sides came after Derek's physical assault during an argument about money and her growing suspicions about his business practices. The police report filed after neighbors called about a domestic disturbance provided documented evidence of Derek's violence and instability, supporting my attorney's arguments that he was hardly the stable family figure best suited to provide guidance for Emma's upbringing. Sarah's willingness to testify about her husband's abusive behavior and financial crimes marked a turning point in the custody battle. The financial investigation that emerged from the custody proceedings revealed the full scope of Derek's embezzlement from Thompson Construction and his theft from our parents' retirement accounts. Bank records subpoenaed during the legal discovery process showed systematic looting of family business assets to fund gambling debts, personal expenses, and payments to the various women he'd been involved with during his marriage to Sarah. The total amount stolen exceeded $200,000 over a 3-year period. Community opinion began shifting as details of Derek's criminal behavior and domestic violence became public knowledge through court filings and police reports. People who had initially supported his position as the legitimate Thompson family heir started questioning whether someone capable of stealing from his own parents and beating his wife was really the moral authority on family values and appropriate child-rearing environments. Local newspaper coverage of the custody battle gradually evolved from sympathetic portrayals of Derek's position to investigative reporting about his business practices. The protective measures I secured included restraining orders preventing Derek from coming near Emma's school or our apartment, as well as supervised visitation requirements for any contact with his own children pending the resolution of criminal charges against him. The court's recognition that Derek posed a potential threat to family members rather than serving as their protector marked a significant victory in the battle for Emma's custody and safety. The transformation of public perception accelerated as more people came forward with stories about Derek's threatening behavior, business irregularities, and manipulation of elderly or vulnerable clients through Thompson Construction. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward case of family dispute over inheritance and legitimacy evolved into a broader examination of Derek's character and fitness as both a business partner and family member. Sarah's decision to provide evidence against her estranged husband represented more than just personal revenge. It was a calculated move to protect herself and her children from the criminal investigation that was rapidly closing in on Derek's business empire. The bank records, credit card statements, and internal company documents she delivered to the district attorney's office painted a comprehensive picture of systematic theft and fraud that had been concealing itself within Thompson Construction's operations for years. The devastating impact on our parents became apparent as the full scope of Derek's financial crimes emerged during the criminal investigation. Dad's retirement fund, which he'd spent 40 years building through careful savings and investment, had been systematically drained to cover Derek's gambling debts and personal expenses. Mom's inheritance from her own parents, money she'd planned to leave for her grandchildren's education, had disappeared into the black hole of Derek's addiction and illegal activities. The total theft exceeded $300,000 when personal accounts were included with business assets. Derek's desperation intensified as criminal charges loomed and his marriage collapsed, leading to his fifth major attack through a private investigator hired to dig up compromising information about my past relationships, parenting choices, and financial management. The Pies investigation backfired spectacularly when his research uncovered evidence of Derek's drug use, domestic violence incidents that hadn't been reported, and additional financial crimes involving tax evasion and insurance fraud. The investigator, apparently possessed of some ethical standards, turned his findings over to law enforcement rather than his client. The collapse of Thompson Construction became inevitable as news of the embezzlement and fraud investigations spread throughout the local business community. Contractors refused to work with a company under criminal investigation, clients cancelled projects, and suppliers demanded immediate payment for outstanding invoices. The business that had taken Dad's entire adult life to build crumbled within months as Derek's crimes became public knowledge, and his ability to operate professionally disappeared. Extended family reactions provided a harsh lesson in how quickly relatives can distance themselves from scandal when their own reputations might be affected. Cousins who had initially supported Derek's position about bloodlines and inheritance began expressing outrage about his theft from our parents and manipulation of family dynamics for personal gain. The same relatives who had questioned my legitimacy as a Thompson now criticized Derek for betraying the family values they claimed were so important to preserve. Emma's insight during this period displayed a level of emotional intelligence that amazed everyone who interacted with her. My 9-year-old daughter began articulating the difference between family relationships based on love and choice versus those defined solely by genetics, explaining to adults that being related by blood didn't make someone a good person, and that kindness mattered more than sharing the same last name. Her ability to process complex family dynamics with such clarity provided guidance for adults struggling to understand how someone they'd trusted could cause such comprehensive destruction. Jim Morrison's gradual integration into our lives accelerated as the truth about Derek's character became undeniable, and the community's attitude toward our unconventional family situation shifted from scandal to sympathy. Jim's quiet presence at Emma's school events, his assistance with practical matters like car repairs and home maintenance, and his genuine interest in building a relationship with both of us created a positive male influence that filled some of the emotional void left by Derek's betrayal and Dad's complicated feelings about my parentage. Derek's isolation became increasingly apparent as former allies abandoned him and criminal charges moved forward. His wife filed for divorce and relocated with their children to her parents' home in another state, effectively ending his relationship with his sons and removing them from the toxic environment he'd created. Business associates testified against him, neighbors reported suspicious activities they'd previously ignored, and even his own attorney seemed to be going through the motions rather than mounting a vigorous defense. The transformation in my own character during this period involved developing a backbone and strategic thinking that I'd never possessed before Derek's attacks forced me to fight for survival. Learning to respond to manipulation with evidence rather than emotion, to build alliances instead of suffering in isolation, and to use legal and social systems effectively rather than hoping for fairness became essential skills for protecting Emma and rebuilding our lives. Family therapy sessions with our parents began the slow process of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by decades of secrets and recent revelations. Dad's struggle to separate his anger about Mom's affair from his genuine love for me required professional guidance, while Mom's guilt about the original deception and her unwitting participation in Derek's manipulation needed to be addressed before any healing could begin. The sessions provided a safe space for expressing pain, anger, and confusion while working toward forgiveness and understanding. The community's growing awareness of Derek's true character created opportunities for rebuilding my professional reputation and personal relationships that had been damaged by his campaign of lies and manipulation. People began apologizing for their rush to judgment, acknowledging that they'd been manipulated by someone they now recognized as a skilled liar and criminal. The process of forgiveness and redemption was gradual, but the foundation for rebuilding was established as truth replaced the fabrications Derek had been spreading. Derek's financial desperation led to increasingly erratic behavior, including attempts to liquidate assets that didn't belong to him and forge documents to access accounts that had been frozen pending criminal investigation. These actions provided additional evidence for prosecutors, while demonstrating that his descent into criminal behavior was accelerating rather than stabilizing, making him an increasingly dangerous threat to anyone who opposed his schemes. The arrest warrant for Derek Thompson was issued on a cold December morning, exactly 2 months after his explosive revelation had shattered our family dinner and set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately expose his criminal empire. Charges included embezzlement, wire fraud, tax evasion, domestic violence, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, representing a comprehensive indictment that covered years of illegal activity hidden behind his facade of respectability and moral authority. Derek's perp walk became front-page news in the local newspaper, with photographs showing him handcuffed and disheveled as he was led from his temporary apartment to the county jail. The same community that had initially rallied around his claims about family values and bloodline purity now witnessed his public humiliation, creating a stark contrast between his previous position as the golden son and his new status as an accused felon facing potential decades in prison. Community apologies began arriving almost immediately after Derek's arrest, as people who had shunned me and Emma started recognizing how thoroughly they'd been manipulated by someone whose own moral character was fundamentally corrupt. Former friends called to express regret about their behavior, neighbors brought casseroles and flowers as gestures of reconciliation, and local business owners offered support for rebuilding my real estate practice. The transformation from pariah to sympathetic figure happened remarkably quickly once the truth about Derek's crimes became undeniable. My real estate agency experienced a dramatic recovery as clients, who had cancelled listings, returned with apologies, and new business referrals began pouring in from people who wanted to support someone they now recognized as a victim rather than a perpetrator. The community's guilt about their treatment of Emma and me translated into professional opportunities and social invitations that helped rebuild both our business prospects and personal relationships. Emma's victory at school came when she finally stood up to the group of children who had been tormenting her about our family situation, delivering a speech to her 4th grade class about how families come in different forms, and that being different doesn't make someone bad or wrong. Her teacher was so impressed with her maturity and articulation that she arranged for Emma to present her thoughts to the entire elementary school during an assembly about tolerance and understanding. The same children who had been cruel to her began seeking her friendship, recognizing her strength and wisdom despite her young age. The reconciliation with our parents required months of family therapy and honest conversations about the pain, secrets, and manipulation that had damaged our relationships. Dad's journey toward accepting me as his daughter regardless of genetics involved confronting his own prejudices about bloodlines and inheritance while recognizing that love and choice mattered more than DNA. Mom's process of forgiving herself for the affair and the subsequent lies required understanding that her mistakes didn't justify Derek's criminal response or his manipulation of family dynamics. Derek's complete downfall became apparent during the trial proceedings, which revealed additional crimes including identity theft, mortgage fraud, and attempted extortion of business competitors. Witness after witness testified about his threatening behavior, financial irregularities, and manipulation of vulnerable elderly clients. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that Derek's attorney recommended plea bargaining rather than risking a trial that would likely result in maximum sentencing. My public speaking at a town meeting about family bullying and redemption provided an opportunity to address the community's role in perpetuating harm through rush to judgment and social exclusion. The presentation emphasized the importance of getting complete information before making decisions about someone's character, the need to protect children from adult conflicts, and the possibility of healing and growth even after devastating betrayals. The positive response suggested that our experience might help other families dealing with similar crises. Legal victory in the defamation and emotional distress lawsuit against Derek provided both financial compensation for the damage he'd caused and official recognition that his actions constituted criminal harassment rather than legitimate family dispute. The court's award included restitution for lost business income, legal expenses, and emotional trauma suffered by both Emma and me during his campaign of destruction. The judgment also included provisions for ongoing mental health support to address the long-term effects of his abuse. Financial recovery accelerated as Derek was forced to liquidate assets to pay restitution and legal fees, with the court ordering the return of stolen family assets and compensation for damages. The house that had been transferred to Derek was returned to our parents. Thompson Construction's remaining assets were distributed to creditors and victims, and Derek's personal property was sold to satisfy judgment debts. The process provided some measure of justice, while demonstrating that criminal behavior ultimately carries consequences. New romantic relationship with Tom Bradley, a divorced father whose son attended Emma's school, developed gradually as my emotional healing progressed and my confidence returned. Tom's understanding of single parenthood challenges, his respect for the complexity of blended family dynamics, and his genuine care for Emma's well-being created a foundation for building something positive from the wreckage of our family crisis. His proposal came after a year of dating, representing hope for a future that included love, stability, and happiness despite the trauma we'd endured. The transformation in community perception was complete when local organizations began inviting me to speak about family resilience, the importance of supporting victims of domestic manipulation, and the need for adults to protect children during family crises. Recognition as someone who had survived and overcome adversity rather than someone tainted by scandal marked a complete reversal in social status and personal redemption. Derek's incarceration at the Dayton Correctional Institution represented the final chapter in his transformation from golden child to convicted felon, a 3-year sentence that provided time for reflection, but little evidence of genuine remorse or personal growth. The minimum security facility housed white-collar criminals and non-violent offenders, giving Derek a relatively comfortable environment that seemed inadequate punishment for the comprehensive destruction he'd caused to multiple families and dozens of victims. My decision to visit Derek after 18 months of his imprisonment was motivated by a need for closure rather than any hope of reconciliation or forgiveness. Emma, now 11 years old and thriving in her new blended family with Tom and his son Marcus, had expressed curiosity about her uncle's situation, but no desire to see him personally. The visit was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in March, chosen deliberately to avoid weekends when other family members might be present. The prison visiting room was exactly what I'd expected from television portrayals. Institutional green walls, plastic chairs, and the constant hum of surveillance equipment monitoring every conversation. Derek appeared smaller than I remembered, his hair prematurely gray, and his confident swagger replaced by the careful movements of someone who'd learned to navigate a world where reputation and family connections carried no protective value. Derek's initial attempt at manipulation began immediately, with carefully crafted expressions of remorse and claims that prison had given him time to reflect on his mistakes and develop genuine regret for the pain he'd caused. His performance was polished, but hollow, lacking the authenticity that would have suggested real personal growth or understanding of the damage his actions had inflicted on innocent family members. The same calculating intelligence that had enabled his crimes was now being applied to the challenge of rehabilitation and eventual reintegration. My response to his manufactured contrition was firm but calm, making clear that I hadn't come seeking reconciliation or offering forgiveness, but rather to establish boundaries and ensure that his future behavior wouldn't threaten Emma's continued healing and development. The conversation became a test of the strength and confidence I'd developed during 2 years of rebuilding my life, demonstrating that his power to intimidate and manipulate had been permanently broken. Derek's breakdown came when he realized that his old tactics weren't effective, and that I was no longer the vulnerable woman he'd attacked at that family dinner. His facade cracked to reveal the desperate, bitter man underneath, someone who still believed that his crimes were justified by his legitimate claim to family assets and his superior moral standing as a biological Thompson. The entitlement and self-pity in his voice confirmed that prison hadn't fundamentally changed his character or worldview. Family healing had progressed significantly during Derek's absence, with Dad fully embracing his role as Emma's grandfather, and Jim becoming a valued friend and father figure. The complex dynamics of our extended family now included Tom's parents and sister, creating a support network that provided stability and love without the toxic manipulation that had characterized our previous family relationships. Holiday gatherings were peaceful and joyful rather than tense exercises in avoiding conflict. Emma's growth into a confident, articulate pre-teenager demonstrated remarkable resilience in overcoming the trauma of Derek's attacks and the family upheaval that followed. Her academic performance was excellent, her friendships were strong and healthy, and her understanding of complex family dynamics showed wisdom beyond her years. Therapy had helped her process the events surrounding Derek's revelation, while building emotional tools for handling future challenges. Community leadership opportunities emerged as other families facing similar crises sought my advice and support. Speaking engagements at churches, schools, and community organizations provided platforms for sharing lessons learned about protecting children during family conflicts, recognizing signs of financial and emotional abuse, and building support networks during times of crisis. The work was personally fulfilling while helping others avoid some of the mistakes and oversights that had enabled Derek's manipulation. Derek's final attack came in the form of letters to the parole board attempting to portray himself as the victim of a vindictive family conspiracy designed to steal his rightful inheritance and destroy his reputation. The letters contained the same lies and manipulations that had characterized his earlier campaigns, demonstrating that incarceration hadn't diminished his capacity for deception, or his belief that he was entitled to sympathy and special consideration. Business success exceeded expectations, as my real estate practice expanded beyond residential sales to include commercial properties and investment consulting. The reputation for integrity and perseverance earned during the crisis attracted clients who valued those qualities and wanted to work with someone who had proven capable of overcoming significant challenges. Financial security for Emma's future was restored and enhanced beyond what would have been possible before Derek's attacks forced me to develop new skills and perspectives. Personal relationships with Tom deepened into a strong partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection for each other's children. Our blended family functioned smoothly, with Emma and Marcus developing a sibling relationship that provided both children with expanded support networks and companionship. The wedding planning process became an opportunity to celebrate new beginnings while honoring the lessons learned from past pain and betrayal. The final confrontation with Derek ended with my clear statement that his release from prison wouldn't change the boundaries I'd established, or restore his access to family relationships he'd destroyed through his own choices. Emma's well-being would continue to be my priority, and any future contact would be contingent on demonstrable changes in his behavior and genuine respect for the damage he'd caused. The conversation concluded without reconciliation, but with my confidence intact and his power definitively broken. 2 years after Derek's explosive revelation tore through our family dinner like a tornado through a trailer park, the landscape of our lives had been completely transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible during those dark early months of crisis and uncertainty. Emma, now 11 years old and radiating confidence that seemed to glow from within, had not only recovered from the trauma of her uncle's attacks, but had developed into a remarkably wise and compassionate young woman whose strength inspired everyone around her. The redefinition of family had become one of the most profound and positive changes in our experience, creating a support network that extended far beyond traditional bloodline relationships. Dad's complete embrace of his role as Emma's grandfather, regardless of genetics, demonstrated that love truly was more powerful than biology in creating meaningful family bonds. Jim Morrison's patient integration into our lives as both father figure to me and grandfather figure to Emma provided stability and wisdom without trying to replace existing relationships. Tom's arrival as my husband and Emma's stepfather completed the circle of male influences who were actively invested in her success and happiness. Derek's release from prison after serving 30 months of his 3-year sentence created temporary anxiety, but his return to our community, as a broken and largely irrelevant figure, demonstrated how completely his power had been neutralized. His attempts to rebuild his life were hampered by his criminal record, the community's long memory of his crimes, and his own inability to accept responsibility for the destruction he'd caused. The man who had once commanded fear and respect now struggled to find employment and housing while battling addiction and mental health issues that prison had exacerbated rather than resolved. My response to Derek's freedom was measured and strategic, maintaining the protective boundaries I'd established while refusing to be intimidated by his presence or potential for causing trouble. The restraining orders remained in effect. Emma's school had been notified about potential security concerns, and our local police department was aware of the history and prepared to respond quickly to any violations or threatening behavior. The preparation was ultimately unnecessary, as Derek's focus remained on his own survival rather than revenge against family members. Emma's perspective on the family crisis had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of human nature and relationship dynamics that impressed adults and provided guidance for her peers dealing with their own family challenges. Her ability to articulate the difference between biological relationships and chosen family, the importance of forgiveness without enabling destructive behavior, and the value of learning from painful experiences had made her a sought-after friend and confidant among her classmates. The community impact of our family's public crisis and recovery had ripple effects that extended far beyond our personal experience, creating awareness about the signs of financial and emotional abuse within families and the importance of supporting victims rather than rushing to judgment based on incomplete information. Local organizations began implementing protocols for recognizing and addressing family manipulation, while schools developed programs for helping children cope with adult conflicts and complicated family structures. Professional success in real estate had exceeded all expectations as my reputation for integrity, perseverance, and understanding of family dynamics attracted clients who valued those qualities and wanted to work with someone who had proven capable of overcoming significant challenges. The business now employed 3 agents and had expanded into commercial properties and investment consulting, providing financial security that would have been unimaginable during the early days of Derek's attacks. Life lessons emerged from the crisis that transformed my understanding of strength, family, and personal worth in ways that would have been impossible to achieve through ordinary circumstances. The experience taught that being called illegitimate or bastard couldn't define someone's value or potential, that manipulation and intimidation only worked when victims accepted them as truth, and that rebuilding from complete devastation was possible with the right support and determination. Emma's college fund had been restored and significantly enhanced through the combination of business success, legal settlements, and contributions from our expanded family network. Her academic performance and leadership skills suggested that she would have numerous opportunities for higher education and career development, with the added advantage of wisdom and resilience that would serve her well during future challenges. The reflection on Derek's bone-throwing incident had evolved from a moment of trauma into a symbol of choosing love over hatred, family over biology, and healing over revenge. The image of that greasy chicken bone landing on Emma's plate still had the power to evoke anger, but it also represented the moment when we stopped being victims and started becoming survivors, who would ultimately thrive despite the cruelty of someone who should have protected us. Hope for the future was grounded in the solid foundation we'd built from the wreckage of our old family structure, creating something stronger and more authentic than what had existed before Derek's revelation exposed the lies and manipulation that had been festering beneath the surface for decades. Emma's upcoming teenage years would unfold within a family environment characterized by honesty, mutual respect, and genuine care rather than the toxic dynamics that had previously defined Thompson family relationships. The final chapter of our story was still being written, but the trajectory was clearly upward, filled with possibilities for continued growth, happiness, and success that honored both the pain we'd endured and the strength we'd discovered in overcoming it. Derek's attempt to destroy us had ultimately freed us from dysfunction and enabled us to create something better than what we'd lost. What do you think about the power of chosen family versus biological family? Have you ever experienced a situation where someone's true character was completely different from what they presented to the world? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about how families can heal from betrayal and manipulation. If this story touched you or reminded you of your own family challenges, please hit that like button to let me know it resonated with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming adversity and finding strength in unexpected places. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that healing is possible even after the most devastating family betrayals. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most difficult and ultimately transformative periods of my life. Remember that your worth isn't determined by other people's opinions or actions, and that sometimes the family you choose becomes stronger than the family you're born into. Until next time, keep fighting for the love and respect you deserve.